Welcome to another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Spelman, and as always, I'm joined here with, well, not as always because we keep changing it, but I'm joined with my lovely co host and colleague, Justin Brackenridge. Justin, how are you doing?
I'm good, Ryan. Yeah, maybe changing this stuff around. We're gonna try and keep people on their toes and a little more engaged, and maybe that'll help, right? Having kind of rotating hosts a little.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you hear the saying, distance makes the heart grow
There you
fonder.
go.
So,
Yeah.
it,
Uh,
it'll help our relationship as well. So,
and it's such a unique group, right? We've all kind of got something different to bring to the table and kind of a different perspective with you and your pathology background and row cropping, and mine is more fertility and forages, and Dwayne has, his practical on-farm experience and his relationship with forage and grain, but it's often different thoughts or different kind of patterns and coming to questions than what you and I have. So I think it makes for a fun dynamic with the three of us.
yeah, that's right. I think we have a really rounded out group of expertise between the three of us. So I think this is going to be great moving forward. So, anyways, well, today what we're going to talk about it kind of follows in cue to our last episode, which
Yeah.
was harvest do's and don'ts, right? So, after we harvest, one of our biggest decisions we have to make before we get into the winter and the next season is weed management, right? So Justin, why don't you maybe describe a little bit more in
Sure.
detail what we're going to talk about today?
Yeah, so this is kind of a mixed bag. We're going to call it like our fall spraying management thing, right? And so, like Ryan said, what about fall burndown? And for years, we've talked about mare's tail, and we're seeing palmer and water hemp and chickweeds and stuff kind of getting worse. And yeah, people look at this as like, hey, it's a fall burn down, it's an expense, I don't have any crop. But if we can do a little bit of maintenance in the fall pretty inexpensively, does that set us up for a better spring control and, subsequently a better in season post application, right? We're not fighting with as much weeds because we've kind of nipped back some of these rosettes early. So we're going to talk about that, like when to do it, what to do, how to target, and how to manage that with cover crops. So the other big thing that we're going to discuss, and it's kind of one of my passion projects, is just pasture hay, uh, woody perennial, autumn olive, multiflora rose, when to do it, how late in the fall we can do it, what treatments work best, general kind of maintenance of forages to get us set up for a good spring moving into next summer, right? And I think it's kind of an interesting time because we've been really dry. Our grasses have been kind of tamped back some. We've seen a lot different weeds. Uh, Horse nettle, kind of the weed of the year, right? And we're going to talk with Dwight about how we can manage some of these things.
One of the things we mentioned in the last episode is that harvest in some cases will be a little bit earlier. So given that, you might have a little bit extra opportunity to make a timely herbicide application. So that's one of the things we're going to discuss here today. So Justin kind of mentioned that Dwight's going to join us today, and Dwight Lingenfelter is our herbicide and weed management specialist on our team, and he's been on many times before, so he's a friend of the show, and I don't think he really needs an introduction. So we're going to kind of jump right into it. So thank you, Dwight, for being on today, and with that, let's get into it.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. As far as thinking about fall burn down and what to be thinking about in terms of what weeds or what herbicides or other management strategies, you think about this time of year is a good time to spray. A lot of these winter annuals that will be starting to germinate or maybe already have germinated. But also there's also other things like perennials. Some of the perennials like dandelion. Even like Canada thistle, some of the other ones that are really, going to start to take off here as we get it, later into the kind of the cooler temperatures, and even some biennials, the rosettes of some of these biennials, think about some of the, whether it be like a thistle, like a musk thistle or a bull thistle, plumeless thistle. Those are all biennial weeds. Even things like poison hemlock or wild carrot. Those are all those 2 year life cycle weeds. So any of those, there would be kind of, targets, at this time of year. I think, when most people think about, fall burn down, they really are kind of targeting some of these, more the winter annuals, things like common chickweed, mare's tail, henbit, dead nettle, things like that. Are ones that are really good to go after before they start getting too large. You think about, something like common chickweed, and it really thrives in kind of these cooler temperatures. In fact, in some there's been some studies on it done on it, and it actually can, grow down to, single digits from, the temperature standpoint. So even it's still kind of growing, maybe not be thriving, but it's still, growing, even under these real cool conditions. So that's one of those where, if it has some mild temperatures, going into the fall and even into the spring, it can be pretty unruly. So waiting too long, especially waiting till spring, can be a challenge to try to get it under control. So that's why, I really suggest, getting some control tactic on it yet, this fall, so it doesn't get out of control, or even things like, mare's tail. So those are some typical weeds that, we're kind of targeting when we think about fall burn down.
Dwight, with the list that you went through, predominantly and maybe all broadleaf species, are we ever really looking at fall, these post-harvest burn downs to target grass species, or is that always like a spring fall kind of problem?
No, that's a good point. I mean, yeah, there are definitely some winter annual, grass species, or even some perennial species that we need to be concerned about. So yeah, things like, like the brome species, things like downy brome or cheat or chess. Those are problem weeds that we deal with, especially in small grains. But of course, they can, develop in a fallow area or after harvest. Things like annual bluegrass or the rough stalk bluegrass is always a challenge. And then even ryegrass, annual ryegrass, Italian ryegrass, those are, pretty prominent in some fields as well. And then you have the old school weeds, something like, excuse me, like quackgrass, a good perennial quackgrass. It's a cool season species, so it can really, start taking off now in these cooler temperatures as well, because of, the deeper root system and so forth. So that's another species that we need to be concerned about too.
So Dwight, there's a lot of species here that we're controlling. You kind of just mentioned some of the grass species, and then our different life cycles of some other weedy broadleaf species. Now, do you recommend that folks be doing a burn down every year, regardless of what they're seeing in the field? Because there's probably some, small, maybe winter annuals that are just coming up. Or is this something where you really want to be out there scouting and deciding whether it's necessary or not?
Yeah, I mean, sure. That's one of those things where I think, we're all, wanting to practice, IPM tactics, and sure, just going out and just kind of, blindly spraying and just assuming that you need to, spray it every year. It's not necessarily necessary. I think that's where yes, scouting first, and having an understanding about where, what weeds have been there or maybe historically there. So yes, obviously, scouting, making sure, what the targets are. Because as we mentioned, it's one thing if you're going after, just a certain subset of broadleaves, but, if there are grasses in there, then obviously you're going to need to include, different types of herbicides in that mixture, in order to target those correctly.
Okay, so you kind of just mentioned the mixture that you might use. So if we're trying to do a fall burn down, and should we usually is that usually going to be just like glyphosate and 2,4-D combo? Is that kind of still the standard for a fall burn down um, in most cases?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the mixtures I typically recommend, for this time of year, as we're getting over the next few weeks here, is kind of a basic mix of glyphosate. And a lot of times, depending on what the formulation is, typically about that quart rate. It could be, plus or minus a few fluid ounces here or there, depending on the formulation, and then 2,4-D. Probably like a 2,4-D ester, probably at about a pint, and I always like to include something like metribuzin. So metribuzin, include that probably anywhere between maybe 3 and 5 ounces, and that'd be the 75% dry. flowable mixture formulation. And the idea is to that's a pretty good mixture for a good spectrum of weeds. So obviously the glyphosate will be there for for grasses, and then also it'll pick up a number of different broadleaf species as well. 2,4-D would be in there to help improve the activity on some of any of the species that are resistant to glyphosate. It has a little bit better activity on things like dandelion. So this is a good time of year to spray the smaller dandelion. So 2,4-D would do a good job with that. And then you have metribuzin, that kind of that lighter rate of metribuzin in there to help complement and pick up some of those other species, and also to provide some initial residual control, in that area. And in most cases, I always try to explain that you don't want to break the bank on this application. It's really meant to be $5 to $10 or $15 per acre at very most. You don't want to be out there spending $20 to $25 an acre, because the reality is you're going to need to be out there again in the spring. Really, this is to kind of get a kind of a head start, if you will, on the burn down process, and not let some of these weeds get too large. So you want to at least kind of keep them at bay, or kill some of the smaller ones. But you have a weed like mare's tail, for example, that has two different flushes. So it's going to have a fall germination phase, and then you're going to have another spring germination phase. So this is really to help alleviate some of those problems of trying to control everything in the spring. And when we're thinking about products, there are other active ingredients, things like Canopy or Canopy EX or some of these other ones that could potentially be used. But you need to start considering you don't want to spend so much money and assuming that you're going to get residual all the way through next year. I know a lot of people ask about spraying something like Prowl this time of year. Well, Prowl is really not a good herbicide for this time of year. It's really more of a summer, a spring and a summer type of a herbicide, because the activity is more leans towards more some of those summer annual type species. So just understanding the product and what it's going to where it's going to fit, can be important. And then on that note, thinking about if you're still kind of up in the air about what you're going to plant next year from a rotational standpoint, that's where that basic mixture of glyphosate, 2,4-D, and metribuzin, that allows you to have a little bit of flexibility whether you want to go to corn or beans. So if you start spraying things like atrazine and simazine, which you could spray at this time of year, and they do have some pretty good activity on certain species, but then you're kind of locked into just planting corn then next year. So, or if you start using higher rates of some other products that are specific for soybeans, then you're locked into soybeans. So that's where you kind of want to have a little bit of flexibility in the choice that you're making for these fall burn downs.
So it sounds like, we've had this conversation, I don't know, maybe 100 times at this point, that like we're looking for this silver bullet or this one size fits all, and that's our burn down in the spring, and that's for post, right? We want one thing that we can spray over everything. And it sounds like that's just not the case for these fall burn downs either, right? Like unless we're sticking with like basic glyphosate 2,4-D, metribuzin maybe, but like if we want to really be specific and target certain weeds, we have to know what we're going into next year to make this kind of more effective. Is that the way we should look at it?
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, so obviously, knowing your target, that's obviously what we need to know. But at the same time, too, as I mentioned, we don't want to. The reality is we're going to have to use a burn down next year, in next spring, I should say. So if we're targeting something like mare's tail, I would kind of maybe caution against something like sharpen. If you want to use sharpen now, it's one thing, but then you're probably going to have to use sharpen again next spring. So that can get a little bit pricey. We start using too many of these herbicides, that from an expense standpoint. So I'm trying to kind of balance the aspects here of what we're targeting versus being realistic about the fact that we will need to come in again next spring, more than likely. I mean, that's to say that, we may have a good job with it, and maybe we end up with a dry winter and maybe a dry spring, and we don't have as much of a flush next spring. But the reality is, in most cases, even though if you do a fall burn down with some light, kind of this basic, burn down program, you're still going to have to come in for some of the other maybe the escapes that have happened, or some of the weeds that start to really take off, more so in the springtime versus here in the fall.
So let's throw kind of a wrench into this, right? If we're thinking about glyphosate 2,4-D metribuzin as our standard burn down that we're going to use in the fall, what if we want to take off our crop and then put in a cover crop? How does that change any of this, right? And I guess let's think about it first as just a cereal cover crop, just rye or wheat or triticale or something like that. And let's talk about how this may change in that scenario.
Yeah, so if we're using more of these, I guess in this case, yeah, grass type of cover crop, that's where, we do have a little bit more flexibility. So I guess, you think about, the aspects of just getting the cover crop established. So what weeds would be there, in before actually planting the cover crop. But then also you need to think about the potential for weeds that will come into the cover crop as well, that may need to be controlled. So that's where I think the utility of more of a grass, like a cereal grain, whether it's a rye or a wheat, or even like a ryegrass. You have a few more options, especially from a burn down standpoint before planting. You have things like sharpen, which has pretty good activity on things like mare's tail, and even some dandelion and things like that. You can get that from some utility out of that, before planting. Or even something like Liberty. Liberty has a 7-day wait. Then you can plant various cover crops after 7 days. So those would be good from a kind of a burn down standpoint, if you will, before establishing that grass cover. But then in the crop, then there's, as I mentioned, you're going to have things like mare's tail and even chickweed and some other winter annuals that are going to germinate in amongst that grass as it's growing. So that's where you have the utility of things like 2,4-D or dicamba that could potentially be used in that crop as it's getting established this fall, and then even next spring. I mean, if the grass, the cover crop is only maybe 6, 8, 10 inches tall, or even a foot tall in the spring, there's still maybe one last opportunity to spray something like 2,4-D in the spring before planting as well. So it just allows more flexibility. So there you're truly integrating your tactics. Not only you having a cover crop, which is a good thing, but then also you're allowing yourself to have some herbicide options. Unlike if you start using these cover crop cocktails, where you're including some kind of a brassica and a legume and a grass and so forth. And again, every time I talk about cover crops, or talk with groups about cover crops, you really need to know why you're planting a cover crop. I mean, if it's to have some ground cover and for weed suppression and so forth, that's one thing. But if you're trying to, scavenge nutrients, or even improve the nutrient, nitrogen or something like that, then you need to know why you're planting the cover crop to begin with. So there again, as a weed scientist, I'm focused on weed control, but at the same time too, there's other things that need to be considered, obviously, as well. When you're deciding what cover crops to plant.
So we can direct people back to season 4, episode 1, Ag Innovations, and where we discuss the cover crop selector, right? The Northeast cover crop tool, where you can go in and follow up exactly what Dwight is saying. Is you put in like, these are my 3 goals, and it's going to tell you what the best mix is to achieve that, so that we're not just buying seeds and putting a lot of things out there that we maybe don't know why we're doing that.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So that's where knowing what the purpose of the cover crop is, and having those goals in mind before you even just go out there and start planting.
So Dwight, you mentioned some of the specialty products like Sharpen, or I guess I don't know what a specialty product would be, but um, when you're planting a cereal cover crop. Now, I just wanted to clarify here. Beforehand you were mentioning glyphosate, 2,4-D, and metribuzin. I can still plant a cereal cover crop after that, right? And how long should I wait after that application if I'm doing that?
Well, yeah, I mean, so those types of products, you need to be careful, especially with something like 2,4-D. That's one where if you look at a 2,4-D label in particular, um, you'll see that there's really not language on the label that allows it to be used before small grain planting, or even like a cool season forage grass planting, because there's always concern for problems with germination. So it's so in essence, according to the label, that it's really not allowed. Now, we have done research on it, and we have found that if you use no more than a pint of 2,4-D, um, and you get about an inch of rainfall and wait 10 to 14 days, in most cases you can get a pretty good establishment of a lot of these grasses, after an application of something like that. So again, you need to be kind of wary of what products you're working with, and then another thing to consider too is this is also as a cover. So it's one thing, you even though there may be a little bit of injury, it's not necessarily the end of the world compared to if this is more of a forage, or excuse me, either a forage or for food, like a food grade product of wheat. Then it kind of shoots it into a different type of a scenario, because then there's always a concern about any residues and so forth that could be potentially in there. So that's what I'm saying, is we have these two kind of worlds where you have the aspect of crop injury itself, but then you also have the issue of residues that still may be in the actual food or feed, what you're trying to use that for after the fact. So yeah, it's kind of one of those things where you always have to go back to what the rotational restrictions are, and the time frames that need to be met until you can start planting these different crops, after these burn downs have been applied.
I think that's, kind of a good wrapping up segue kind of a position, right? So we've talked about fall burn downs, when we can do them, what we can do with them, the weeds that we need to be scouting for, right? Because this is identifying the weed to know. But what you finished on was talking about residues, right? And animal feeds and things like that. And that kind of brings us into our next topic for this fall weed management. And that's talking about pasture and hay weeds, right? And a lot of times, and one of my favorite things in the agronomy guide, and one of the things that I probably give out more than I should, is this calendar of the weed management schedule with pastures and hay and forages, right? I think I tell the folks I work with, I think the biggest mistake we do is we try to manage weeds on our schedule, not theirs. And when we look at that, so many of these are done in the fall. And but this question always comes up, right? We're sitting here September 24th. When is too late to start managing fall weeds, or I guess stop managing fall weeds?
Yeah, and as you mentioned, we do have that table in the agronomy guide, and in fact, it's table 2.6-17 to be specific, if you want to look at in the latest Penn State agronomy guide. But yeah, I mean, we kind of have a general time frame from optimum time, control pasture weeds, and there again, it kind of goes back to knowing your enemy, knowing what we're targeting. Are we targeting perennials, or are we targeting some of these annuals and or biennials? So there again, if you think about a lot of the weeds we're going after, things like horse nettle or milkweed or dogbane, bedstraw, some of these weeds, these problem perennial weeds that we're dealing with, a lot of those are considered warm season. So they come up a little bit later in the spring, then they go dormant a little bit earlier here in the late summer, early fall. And so even if you drive around the area, your farm or roadsides or whatnot, and you see things like milkweed, you'll see that some of the milkweed's already yellowing or even brown, whereas maybe a patch right next to it is still kind of light green or green. And they're starting to go down. The same with horse nettle. That's another warm season perennial that is starting to have its life cycle, the bulk of its growth, and now it's ready to start going dormant. And then also, a lot of it is still, if it's still in the field, it's setting the fruits now. So the fruits are already there, and as soon as it sets the fruits, then it's definitely going to start, going dormant. And then especially with this drought we've been dealing with here the last, several weeks, that's going to force things even quicker to go into dormancy. So if you're out there and you hope to get one last spray in, especially, in some of these species that we talked about here, yeah, I don't know. I guess I really caution against that because I'm afraid you're going to spend, some of your time and effort and waste your, kind of your return on investment there may not be what you're expecting it to be. Now, if we have, other species like Canada thistle, that's a cool season perennial, and that really starts to thrive here under cooler conditions. So, depending on the temperatures and the climate, even into say November. I mean, you could go after something like Canada thistle, well into November in some cases. Assuming we don't get too many cold spells or too many hard frosts and so forth. So that's another thing. So it's dependent upon those kind of climatic conditions as well. But comparing Canada thistle versus horse nettle or milkweed, their life cycles are a little bit different. So just knowing what how they grow and their optimal growth periods is going to be very important.
And I can say from like just now, the way we're sitting in western southwest Pennsylvania, right, there is a clear difference in the visual assessment of these plants, right? And I think if you go out and you look and they're yellowing and senescing and dropping leaves and stuff, I think that's a pretty good indication it's not a good time to spray to target that weed, right? But what we are starting to see is that greening up of some of these other cool season things. Our grasses are starting to show back up. Canada thistle showing back up. And so, this doesn't have to be that complicated. Walk out, scout your fields, look at them, and see what looks like it's alive.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean that's what it boils down to. Again, going back to that kind of that integrated approach, understanding and the first part of that is scouting. Don't I would hate to see just loading up a sprayer and just assuming you're going to go out there and kill the weeds, even though you really haven't thought through some of these the life cycles and they're where they are on that phase of growth because they go dormant and that's the reason a lot of times we'll recommend, especially with some of these warm season perennials, to make sure you target them, kind of, in that August and September timeframe because though they're still, actively growing, but they're also starting to, kind of get ready to go into good dormancy. And the target time is that time frame when you can spray the herbicide and then as the sugars in the plant and the leaves and so forth are starting to head down into the root system, the herbicide can get attached to those sugars and be transported down into the root system for a much better kill. So again, but the plant still has to be actively growing. And as we mentioned, you start seeing yellow, brown or brown tan leaves. That plant is getting well beyond that phase of transporting, the sugars down into the roots. Now it's starting to ready to go dormant, and you're not going to get any herbicide transported at that when they're that old.
Yeah, so that's a good point, and I just want to maybe make a little bit of a clarification for our audience here, and you can nod your head if I'm right on this, but um, when we mentioned that if it's going into dormancy, so maybe it's a summer annual like milkweed, that this wouldn't be a good time to spray, but if it's thistle and it's actively growing, it would be a good time to spray. Well, that milkweed, it's not to say if it's a pasture situation, you have a big milkweed problem, don't do anything. Like that's a great point to go and mow it, right? So that it doesn't form any seed. Or if it's a summer annual that's growing, Is it past the point where it'll produce new seed at this point if it hasn't already?
Yeah, well, so you're bringing up the aspect of summer annuals now. So those are the ones that are dependent upon seeds. So obviously, we're getting to the point now where a lot of the annuals, especially the summer annuals, are in their seed formation phase right now, and so it's getting to the point where I think a good number of them have already set their seed. So even if you do go out there and mow, for example, um, whether you mow or not, those seeds are already viable and probably not going to have much damage to them, per se, from a seed range standpoint to go back into the seed bank. Now, having said that, every situation can be a little bit different. There may be a pocket or two here and there that they're still somewhat green. They're not haven't matured yet fully, and so yeah, I mean, if you can mow, I'd say, mowing would be, obviously a viable, option. And at least maybe you get 50%. I mean, 50%, control of those would be a lot better than letting go to, full seed. And then you're right, even with some of the perennials, that we talked about, yeah, even like with Canada thistle and quack grass and some of these other cool season ones, anytime you can impact them, so you're forcing them to use their root reserves, their carbohydrates and sugars in their roots, then you're forcing them to deplete those. So yes, I mean, if you're struggling with Canada thistle, going out there and mowing them right now is still a viable option, and even mowing them now and then maybe spraying them, as we get into late October, after they have some regrowth, that could even be another way to implement. But a lot of times, we want to think about these things as a whole strategy throughout the year, not just hurry up and rush and do things right now. We want to make sure that we're doing these timely mowings and a couple of routine mowings, like in a pasture setting, for example, at least a couple times during the spring, late spring and summer, and then kind of setting those up, to have the herbicide be taken up, kind of in that late August September timeframe, versus trying to do everything right now at the end of the season when we're kind of getting late. So again, it's a planning process, in order to set these things up, throughout the season.
So I also see kind of the mowing thing. And when I think about mowing a lot, it's often on maybe like underutilized or undergrazed pastures is having a lot of utility too. And is another one of those points you can say, that's crazy. But if we're trying to set ourselves up for that spring spray, and where I'm at, there's a lot of strip ground or there's a lot of, just kind of fallow ground, and you've got weeds out there that are 4 feet tall. We might get enough snow to kind of knock that down some in the winter, but this mat gets like really, really intense, right? And so if we are trying to target spring stuff, does it help us get better contact with those smaller plants? And I guess in my mind, it makes sense, right? If we're trying to spray over all of this grass, there's all of these other places for that chemical to intercept before it actually makes it to the bottom. And maybe that doesn't make sense, but it kind of does to me.
Yeah, very much so. I mean,
Okay.
you're right, because the majority of herbicides that we're using on in these pasture hayfield settings are these foliar herbicides. They actually have to be in contact with the plant itself in order to kill. So anything you can do to allow that spray droplet to contact that green tissue of the weed, is important. So yeah, if you have a bunch of trash or residue or whatever that's this could potentially intercept, that, then it's obviously of no value. Then it's not killing it's not like a residual herbicide where you could spray it on some different the different organic matter, and then it gets washed down into the soil after rain falls. With these herbicides, that's not the case. You need to have good contact and coverage of the green foliage in order for them to have activity. So yes, just kind of just general maintenance, of those areas can be important too, as far as just mowing and getting preparing for that utility of that spray, then next spring.
And so like just a context thing, is if you go out in some of these fields or all of these like really dense things and you get a tenth of an inch of rain, you stick your hand down in the bottom and see how much of that infiltrates, right? And that's 2,700 gallons compared to us spraying at what, 15 to 20 gallons?
Yeah, I mean, I hear this argument every once in a while. People think, well, I'll just increase my spray volume to,
Right.
30 gallons or 40 gallons per acre, and instead of spraying it at, maybe 15 gallons per acre. And you're right, that argument doesn't hold when it comes to
Yeah.
spraying things. So you can't put enough herbicides, the spray volume, in order to equal anything near what a rainfall can be. Yeah, that's kind of a misconception out there, just thinking increasing spray volume is going to really improve the control. It's not the case. So.
So what about anything we can do to improve activity, right? In the last few years, I've really been pushing like adjuvants and surfactants, and we're trying to do more with less, and things are getting more expensive. Is there any advice you can give us if we are going to go out and target things like the Canada thistle and some of these cooler seasons that can help improve the activity that we are going to get?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, you're spending the money on the herbicide, so you want to optimize it. You need to make sure that herbicide gets into the plant. So yes, the use of adjuvants, whether it be kind of a surfactant, a non-ionic surfactant like an 80/20 or 90/10, those have some use, or some kind of an oil. So whether it's a crop oil concentrate or a methylated seed oil, those can be recommended as well. And again, it depends. It depends on the herbicide. There are some of these newer products, like Grazon Next and Nova Graze and a few of the other ones. They do recommend including some kind of an adjuvant with the spray, in order to get them into the plant much better. You have other ones, for example, like 2,4-D and dicamba, or even like Crossbow. They don't really recommend those, is much. So it really is going to depend on the type of herbicide, and looking at the label to see what is recommended. And we also have a table in the agronomy guide, that expounds upon what's recommended, so surfactant or an oil or whatnot, or even like a liquid nitrogen or AMS or a UAN. So that would be one thing to make sure you look at. And again, the thing about return on investment, if the companies are recommending it, and s- to have their product have improved performance, you better do it, because otherwise you're gonna be frustrated if you get a lack of control, especially in these situations where we have under drought conditions, or and where the cuticles, the leaf, the waxy tissue on the leaf surface is kind of hard to penetrate, with just the herbicide itself. So that's where the use of an adjuvant can really help get it through that and get it into the internal components of the leaf tissue, where the herbicide can do its activity, because it needs to get into the leaf in order to move around the plant and do its control. So if it's just sitting there on the leaf surface, it's not going to have the effectiveness, as what the herbicides are designed for.
Sure. So maybe we can pivot here a little bit. So we've been talking a lot about some of our herbaceous weeds, those that are winter, annuals, perennials, biennials. Now, what about woody plants? So, maybe we're talking about a pasture situation, maybe it's a field crop situation, and we have some woody weed issues. Maybe autumn olive or multiflora rose. Is the fall also a good time to control those? Is this a good opportunity to do that?
Yeah, so with woody species, and again, there's a lot of different ones you can consider. As you mentioned, autumn olive, multiflora rose. Another one that I get questions about routinely is porcelain berry, which is a viney one. You get things like honeysuckle, even poison ivy. And there's kind of a listing of many of these other types of exotic shrubs, or kind of these bushy type plants that basically form a woody structure to them. And Yes. I mean, there can be some value to going after these, in the fall or even during the dormant season. But again, you have to know what you're doing. So for example, you look at some of these labels, like crossbow, for example, or ones that contain triclopyr. You can do what's called these basal bark applications or these dormant season applications. But in those cases, you really need to, add the product to some kind of a diesel fuel or a kerosene or whatnot to help penetrate that bark layer to get actually into the tissue, of the woody plant. So they can be, have their own challenges, of themselves to try to, as you're applying these. A lot of times what I'll recommend though is, especially for something like multiflora rose or some of these other ones, they're going to leaf out again next year. And so multiflora rose, I typically recommend during the flowering stage, like late May, early June, when the leaves and flowers are present, is really one of the better times to go after something like multiflora rose. It's easier to spray the bush at that time, so that's where I'd recommend something like a crossbow plus maybe a met sulfuron mixture, and then just if you have a little ATV sprayer that has maybe a single wand on it where you can just kind of just spray up and around the foliage and the bush of the woody, is probably just as good as just trying to go after it at this time of year. Um, Now, as I mentioned, there are some situations where you can do that, but I just find that once as it has foliage on the leaves, it tends to be a little bit better way to get it into the plant, compared to going through the bark layer. And another thing with all these woody species, there is some concern about, especially as they start to flower, things like porcelain berry and other woodies, they have these nice flowers on them that the bees, are attracted to. So finding that a correct time, to spray those where you're not interacting with the bee activity and so forth can be another time to really think about getting it on the leaves, but then not too late during the flower stage. So again, we do have some different fact sheets here. If you're interested in controlling some of these woody species, some of my colleagues have put some of those together that really spend some time going through the nuances of controlling these types of species. But the reality is most of them are going to recommend some kind of a triclopyr. A triclopyr, a crossbow remedy, ones like that are in most cases pretty universal. Now, obviously, including glyphosate is possible, but with that, then you're setting yourself up for killing grasses and other desirable species underneath that, and a lot of people don't want to do that. So again, it just comes down to kind of time management, I realize a lot of people in late May and early June are more concerned about other aspects of their farming operation and not really thinking about, trying to control, perennial weeds. But again, so whatever, from your standpoint of time management, if it's easier to do it in the fall, you could probably do that, or the dormant season. But again, putting these herbicides on, it takes a different way of applying them, compared to just spraying the foliage in that spring summertime.
So you've teed me up for a whole bunch of questions. So maybe I'll apologize for shooting them out this fast. But so the first one is you really mentioned crossbow and metsulfuron is like this combination. And I want to go backwards a little bit to where we were talking about adjuvants, right? If you read the metsulfuron, it's going to call for non-onyx surfactant. If you read crossbow, it's going to say not recommended. Um, how does someone kind of bridge this gap? And what do you do in that scenario if you are going to mix those two chemicals?
Yeah, well, in a case like that, you have to make in a lot of cases, something like crossbow, it doesn't necessarily say you can't use it. It just doesn't. It's just really not recommended. So in the case like that, you would follow the recommendation for something like metsulfuron. So
Okay.
something like metsulfuron needs it. So that's where you would include it as well. Now, having said that, that also could set you up for, if you are doing more of a broadcast application, spraying it over, grasses, your desirable forage grasses, that could lead to some additional burning of the crop itself, and maybe a little bit of crop injury or stunting. So that's where all these things, yes, they will come into play. But in a case like this, where we say mixed crossbow and metsulfuron, and you're going to go out and spray, the rose bushes, then the amount is not going to be as much on the whole grassy forage as well. So that's where you want to make sure that you're using the right adjuvant system to get the metsulfuron in as well. But then of course the crossbow would be taken in addition to that.
And I mean, the reality is, we've looked at a couple different options. One of them is something mixed with like a fuel oil type treatment, which is
Mhm.
certainly you're going to have some off-site damage with something like that, right? And it's going to be the other option is looking at something like glyphosate, and your potential is high for any kind of dripping down and burning around it. So you may experience a little bit of damage, but when you compare the options you have, using that non-ionic surfactant with something like those products, a little bit of burning really doesn't sound too bad.
Right. Yeah. And then again, that's kind of where you have these trade-offs. You want to kill the weed and accept a little bit of crop damage for a limited time, versus just maintain your having that weed always be in there. So yeah, so yeah, there's always going to be a little bit of collateral damage, with a lot of these situations. So we don't live in a perfect world, and there's always going to be a little bit of concessions that have to be taken in order to control the weeds, but at the same time to maintain the area, the forage area with some kind of transient injury that
Mhm.
grows out of it.
So what about a product like Spike? Is
Yeah.
that they used to be more common
hmm
than it is now, maybe?
Yeah, I mean that's another one where that's what you're referring to there is it's a dry, it comes in a pellet.
Yep.
So you do not mix it with water. So you actually have the utility of that, where you pour out a designated amount, and then just kind of literally throw it underneath the bush of the tree, or the around the root system there. And yes, it can be, have its advantages because of that ease of use. But also at the same time too, it's a herbicide that is pretty broad spectrum, so it can kill a lot of the forages that we have. So especially if you're using some of these on a hillside, for example, and you throw a handful of these pellets underneath a multiflora rose bush, and then all of a sudden you get some rainfall, and then there's that rainfall can actually leach some of that herbicide, so there could be a streak of that product that you'll see 10, 20, 30 feet on the lower end of that bush, if it's on like a hillside, for example. So you can get a little bit of movement of that product, depending on the physical location of that, the tree or the bush, or the target weed in relation to the forage. But yeah, something like that can be used. In fact, I know, a number of years ago, 20, 25 years ago, we were working with DuPont at the time. They were actually trying to figure out a way to impregnate this metsulfuron onto just urea pellets, and then you put a certain amount of the herbicide onto urea, and then take the urea and just throw that impregnated onto the urea and throw that underneath the multiflora rose bush, similar to spike. But unfortunately, they never really got that optimized, and it worked to some degree, but there was still some kind of glitches with this. It didn't work as well as we were hoping it to be. So yeah, things like that have been tried over the years. But again, and a lot of times it comes back to kind of this foliar application that seems to be the most consistent, I should say.
Yeah. And so then the last point I want to bring up is we've talked a lot about crossbow. Um, one of the things to be careful with crossbow is like grazing intervals, right? For the beef cattle world or other livestock, this is kind of a non-issue, right? But when we start thinking about lactating dairies, it's a whole different ball game.
Right. Yeah, and that yeah, that's very important. Yeah, when we're dealing with these anything in a pasture or hay setting, yeah. Again, we have a table for that as well in the agronomy guide. It's a very useful table, and it provides some details on how long do you need to wait and after an application if you want to graze or if you want to hay that area and and you're right. I mean, the biggest thing you'll notice on those tables or in the label is the aspect of the lactating animal. So there are some herbicides that you could spray and then the animals can be the other the livestock can be released right back into that area immediately. Whereas if they're lactating, then you really need to wait either 7 days or 14 days or 21 or whatever's on that specific listing for that particular product. So again, that's another thing that we definitely want to make sure that we point out as well, is that just understanding the utilities of making sure that you can have the animals in another paddock or something that hasn't been sprayed, if you have to keep them out of there for a certain amount of time.
So for curious minds, that's table 2.6-14. I don't have them on top of my head like Dwight does, but I can find them in a pinch. So the last thing I want to bring up, right, before we kind of start to wrap up, is this conversation that we have for farmsteads and fence rows and things like that, right? We just talked the other day, and I've been pushing this that if we're mowing and spraying our fields, but we're not treating our homesteads and our fence rows, we're really wasting a lot of time with this, right? And one of the ones that I see the worst for that is cocklebur. And where I'm at, cocklebur is incredibly prominent. We mow them around, and then we call our cows back. And what do? Is they walk the fence line and they pick up all of those cockleburs off of them, and we go through this all over again.
Yeah.
So where do we find information? How do we handle that kind of stuff?
Yeah, and you're right. As the old saying, the grass is always greener on the other side. So that's the reason they're always huddling up against the fence lines there. But yeah, no, again, that's another important area that we really need to think about when we think about overall weed management is these areas that people tend to neglect and fence rows and just around farmstead structures and things like that where there's a lot of weeds that they grow up there and then there's issues with seeds being moved around whether it be by livestock themselves or other wildlife deer or other rodents or whatnot that can move these weeds. So again, that's when we talk about integrated weed management, we talk about this very thing of just preventing weeds from entering an area, and and this is all part of it, is to just control weeds in situations like this, around fence lines and so forth. And yeah, I mean, there's several different products. In fact, we going back to the agronomy guide again, we have a table in the agronomy guide, and it's actually table 2.6-19, and that actually goes into all the specifics about what herbicides are available for that, and then you need to be thinking about the fact that the herbicides that are used also have to have grazing and haying allowances as well. So just going out there and just selecting the herbicide that has the longest residual is not necessarily the answer. So on that same thought there, you need to consider some herbicides like Roundup and 2,4-D and dicamba could be used, but they're not going to have any residual component to them. So that's a lot of times you would need to mix those with something like maybe Arsenal or there's another one called Pramitol or another one called Resilon, that have these longer residuals, up to a few months or more, that will control the different species under that fence area. So again, things like that need to be thought about when you're putting with these different herbicide programs together. And then also just knowing how much to mix. Are you just going to make say a 1 foot band underneath the fence line, or are you going to try to do like a 3 foot band? And just knowing how to calculate that, for your amount of fence line you have, or around farmsteads or whatnot, just how much to mix up, can be an important aspect of treating these areas as well.
Yeah, so I think that's you mentioned a few things and they're like calibration's important with that too, right? How often are people, if they're using a smaller sprayer, backpack sprayer, and HVR calibrating? And that's going to be really important to decide your rate in that case as well. And also consider those grazing restriction for those products as well. So I think we can probably wrap it up there. Is there anything else, Justin, that you want to ask?
Yeah, there was one. I said earlier I
There we
had three
go.
questions and I only got to two of them, right? So thank you for keeping count. Um, so when we're spraying a lot of these things, Dwight, and maybe this is something that's uh often they're like a triclopyr, like a remedy, but then there's often a similar type product, but it doesn't have the water quality advisory, or it gives you a little bit better ability to use that, right? Aquaneat and can you talk to us a little bit about how we make decisions, or because I mean, a lot of the times the woody stuff's growing up in the areas that we can't get to. We don't put cows on, we can't mow it, and so it is often wet. How do we go about kind of figuring out what to use in that case?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, that's a situation where there are certain products that have what's called an aquatic label. For some of these riparian areas that do have, either flowing water, or maybe just kind of standing water. And you're right. You need to make sure you're using the right product, because the products are formulated differently. So if we're on kind of a terrestrial area, and there's no water in the vicinity of where we're spraying, then there's different additives and so forth in that formulation that may be potentially harmful to the aquatic life. However, that's where these companies, they develop these aquatic labels that have slightly different formulation that allows for utility around these wet areas. And again, that's again all to protect the habitat, the various different creatures and so forth that are in that water body. Also, then it protects it from just the herbicides flowing in different areas and causing problems elsewhere, maybe downstream or to another location. So you definitely need to make sure you're using products that are approved for these types of settings. And as you mentioned, yeah, there are things like 2,4-D and glyphosate and triclopyr, and several other ones have both what kind of terrestrial label, and they also have an aquatic label. So make sure you're using the right product, for the right setting.
Okay, well, I'm done with questions and thank you.
No, I think that's a good one though, because we have no shortage of waterways, and a lot of them we're adjacent to, especially in a lot of pasture settings. So I think that's an important note. Um, cool. Well, Dwight, anything else that you want to get to that you haven't today, or?
I don't think so. I think we covered quite a few different aspects and topics there of things to think about this time of year and otherwise. So I appreciate being able to chat with you, and look forward to doing it again in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Dwight. It's always great. I think you're right. We covered a lot here. We covered kind of given any situation that you have out there, whether you're harvesting a fall crop, or you have a pasture that has some later weed problems. Hopefully there's a lot of relevant information in here for you that you can kind of get right out there and make this decision sooner rather than later. So I think this was a really productive discussion and has some really useful stuff in here. And I think if nothing else, this is a great plug for the agronomy guide, because as Dwight was mentioning all these tables, we'll have to plug the agronomy guide in the bottom here in the episode notes, because For those of you that are really getting into weed control, there's a lot of helpful tables that will help you to make some of these decisions on what products to use for some of these different species. So with that, Dwight, thank you for coming on today. We really appreciate it. Your knowledge is always welcomed here. And to our listeners, we'll catch you on the next episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast.